All right, so the story of the B-45 is really a story of America responding to German technological advances in regards to air power during World War II, the Luftwaffe. And they had a pretty large program to build experimental aircraft that Hitler called them wonder weapons. Lots of the V2. You had the buzz bombs. You had a ton of different giant rail car cannons. Uh, but one of their main focuses was jet aircraft. Well, the Arado 234 was the world's first um, operational jet bomber. Um, in 1940, the Reich Air Ministry put out a request to have a jet-powered aircraft with they wanted like a 1,400-mile range. Arado was actually the only company to even respond. They had an experimental aircraft called the E-370. It had a estimated top speed of about 480 miles per hour and an operating altitude of about 36,000 feet. So it was considerably already better than most Allied prop aircraft at the time. But it was used in a recon role a couple times, um, and it startled the Allies because they basically couldn't do anything with the plane because it's just top speed was just way faster than anything we had. So it could just outrun everything we had, so we couldn't even intercept it. So it kind of startled the high command in the United States, and there was a big hubbub about getting an American jet-powered tactical bomber built and developed. So almost immediately they started working on it in 1944. Um, they had two prototypes that were delivered by the end of 1941, but they had trouble getting reliable engines until about July of 1943. By June of 1944, by the time D-Day happened, they had about 20 aircraft that were actually delivered and operational. Um, they had a shortage of a lot of the elements they needed to make high grade stainless and stuff like that. So they had to basically make the insides of the turbines out of this regular steel. So they had to be completely rebuilt after only about 10 hours of operation. So that was a pretty big damper on the German jet program. The most notable use of the AR-234 was as an actual bomber, not just a recon plane. Was the attempt to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge. So between March the 7th and the 17th, 1945, when the bridge finally collapsed, the bridge was constantly attacked by AR-234s carrying 2,200-pound bombs. The aircraft actually continued to fight in a scattered fashion right up until May 8th, when Germany finally surrendered. Um, Ultimately, only about 210 aircraft were actually delivered to the Luftwaffe. Um, so, because of the Arado 234, the B-45 was kind of pushed into development. It was our first operational jet bomber. It was also the first multi-engine jet bomber to be mid-air refueled. Um, it was introduced April 22nd, 1948, and it was retired roughly in 1959. Even though a few of them kept flying as test platforms for different things up until the early 70s. Um, but they decided basically that it was time we needed to get serious about building our own jet-powered bombers. But the war pretty much ended before any serious work was done to actually produce a jet bomber, and many of the ongoing projects or development work was paused or completely canceled altogether because of budget constraints. The tension, though, that arose from the new Soviet Union soon ushered in a new motive to basically develop a jet bomber, and by around mid 1946, a few prototypes had been made and were being tested by the Defense Department. Finally, on around January 2nd, 1947, the B-45 was put into production. They were actually originally planning to outfit 5 light bomber groups and 3 reconnaissance groups, but that actually changed when a new design, the B-47 Stratojet, was being tested, and it was pretty obvious that that was the future. Just a much larger, longer range plane. But the technology at the time, they had to, it was going to take a lot longer to develop the B-47. So they basically decided to build the B-45 as a like a fill-in until then. But soon after Truman administration's budget cuts, they cut a lot of the numbers for the B-45s. They were actually originally planning on making hundreds of them, but they actually ended up only making around 142 in all their configurations combined. So that's a pretty big cut. Um, it wasn't really until the Korean War that the B-45 actually found a little bit of a niche to fill for the Air Force. The B-29s basically flying over Korea were sitting ducks for the MiG-15s. They were just eating them alive basically because they were so slow and basically not maneuverable at all. So the Air Force decided to, well, first of all, they were terrified because our entire European strategic nuclear strike force was B-29s armed with nuclear weapons. And guess what they would have been flying into, and if they were trying to go do a mission in Russia, MiG-15s. So they were absolutely terrified that the B-29s wouldn't even be able to drop nuclear weapons on Russia. If anything, actually, if a nuclear war had broken out, the B-29s would just be defenseless. So the United States basically had no way of actually deploying nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union. So what they actually did was they looked at the B-45 and it had enough, it could carry enough weight, about 22,000 pounds, so it could actually carry the newer versions of nuclear weapons. So what they did is they took around 40 or so of the B-45s and they modified them with a new defense system, a whole bunch of electronics, and additional wing tanks for additional fuel to make them longer range. They basically turned them into tactical nuclear strike bombers. They began arriving in Great Britain in May of 1952. At the same time, modified B-45s also began to arrive in Japan. They were the reconnaissance version, though, not an actual tactical bomber. Um, they actually flew several long-range missions over the Soviet Union in the 50s. That they were actually classified. They were reconnaissance missions to take photos of different things. Basically, before the U-2 or the SR-71 was built, they used the B-45 as a spy plane in a way, like a makeshift spy plane, because it could actually get up pretty high. In July of 1952, a B-45 made the first trans-Pacific flight nonstop and used mid-air refueling twice to complete this task. That was a pretty big milestone in aviation history. But by the mid-1950s, the B-45s were beginning to be replaced by the B-47s, that had finally been pressed into service and were going, basically, by then. Most of the B-45s were completely removed from active duty by 1958 or so. Like I said, a few of them were kept online just for test planes for different equipment and things like that. The B-45 had 4 crew, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and a tail gunner. The MD weight was 45,694 pounds. It had 4 GE J47 turbojet engines, 5,200 pounds of thrust apiece. Its maximum speed was 566 miles per hour. Its service ceiling was 46,000 feet, so it could get decently high for that time period. It never really achieved any noteworthy accomplishments or served a grand role in the Cold War, but it does deserve its credit for being the first jet bomber in United States history, and especially, it's the first atomic jet bomber. It was the first jet that was ever built that could carry tactical nuclear weapons to the enemy. So that's basically Legacy of the B-45.